Well, this morning we're going to start a new series. This is really a continuation of the doctrine series that we've been doing. If you remember last week, I was introducing this, that the next doctrine for us to cover is eschatology. We're supposed to be looking at the future. And so much of what the Bible has to say about the future really finds its roots in the book of Daniel. And so I said, well, let's just walk through Daniel. Instead of just hitting highlights from Daniel, let's just walk through the book. And so it's still kind of part of our bigger series, but I think it'll be a good thing for us. The book of Daniel is not because of the name of it, but just for other reasons, is one of my favorite books. There's so many neat things about it. You start, it's some of the best stories that you remember from growing up. You got Daniel in the lion's den, you got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the handwriting on the wall. There's so many great stories in this book to begin with. And then interspersed in all of that is the parts of the book that we really never read. It's like we imagine that after Daniel chapter 6, after Daniel gets out of the lion's den, that everything else is a footnote. And it's not. There's some of the most amazing, some of the most specific prophecies anywhere in Scripture come out of this book specifically. And again, it's going to be a foundation for so much of what the rest of the Bible talks about as far as things to come. And so there's a lot of neat things in the book. But I do want us to focus on the fact that this book is more than just fascinating. It's not just that it's interesting. I think one of the purposes, one of the reasons why God had this book recorded for his people originally was to be an encouragement to them in some very difficult times. That this was a book that came out of, we'll see in just a moment, the captivity of Israel as they were carried off into a foreign land. And for a lot of, I think, the nation seeing that happen kind of wondered, is this the end? That God let us go into captivity. Our nation's been dispersed. Our kingdom is no more. Our best days are behind us. And there would be this question of, is God done with us? Are our best days truly behind us? And the book of Daniel is really going to serve as an encouragement to them that yes, there are some problems that are being dealt with. There are some sins that need to be corrected. There's some adjustments that needed to be made. But God has a plan. God has a purpose. And God is going to work through these difficult times to ultimately see his goals accomplished. We know from history that later on in Jewish history, shortly before the time of Christ, that Israel went through another difficult time. And it was this book that they often look back to remind themselves that God does have a plan, that God does have a purpose. Jesus is going to quote from this book when he's encouraging his disciples about the future and telling them what God is doing and what God's plans are. He'll refer back to and quote from this book. And so I do want you to catch that the ultimate point of this book is not just to entertain us with fun stories. It's not just to fascinate us with interesting prophecies. It's ultimately to encourage us. And as we look at some of the themes in just a moment that come out of this book, I hope you'll see that. And as we kind of walk through the book of Daniel over the weeks to come, I want you to appreciate the fact that if this book has always been intended to be an encouragement to God's people, it's even more so for us because we have the rest of God's revelation to help us understand it, honestly, even better probably than Daniel did. There's a number of times we'll see in the prophecies when God gives Daniel a prophecy, Daniel will be like, I don't understand. And God says, not yet. But we're going to have other scriptures, we're going to have other information that gives us an even better perspective on some of these things even than they had. And if that's the case, then certainly we can be encouraged by it. So let's start with a little bit before we get into verse 1. You can go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. And we're going to start walking through, but we're going to spend a little bit of time just kind of orienting ourselves to where this book is, what's been going on, what's been happening as we start into this. Now, Mr. Goodson there, he always appreciates a good timeline. He's our history person. So I'm going to start you out with a little bit of a timeline, just so we can kind of orient ourselves to where this is. Where are we in biblical history? And one of the things that's going to come up, and we'll probably refer back to this a number of times throughout the book, because who's in charge of the world at the time is kind of a big deal throughout this book. It's kind of one of the many themes. So let me kind of connect it with maybe some other things that you're familiar with from Old Testament history and Bible history. If you remember, especially when you get to the middle part of the Old Testament, you start going through a series of different kingdoms that take over that part of the world. The world is kind of dominated and oriented around certain kingdoms. around the 700s, around 722, the Assyrian Empire was kind of the biggest deal. They kind of controlled this whole region, and there's a lot of the Old Testament stories that involve these Assyrian kings and the captivity. Eventually, they'll take Israel captive, the kingdom to the north, and carry them off into captivity. That was kind of the first big one, and eventually they'll give way to the Babylonians. We'll see that transition here in just a moment. The Babylonians conquer the Assyrians, and now they rule the world. Eventually, that kingdom will give way to the Medo-Persians. We'll see that in the book of Daniel a little bit later. Eventually, you got people like Alexander the Great, who's going to sweep down from Greece, and he's going to take over the world. And then eventually the Romans will come in, and they'll take over the world, and that takes us all the way up to the time of Christ. So the world is going through this series of transitions of world powers, people in charge. We'll come back to that in a little bit and ask the question, is that part of what we're supposed to notice from the book of Daniel? All these times where we think somebody's in charge, we'll have to ask the question, who's really in charge? Even though the kingdoms rise and fall, even though nations come and go, even though people get caught up in, I guess the word we probably use today is politics, and fretting about who's sitting in the big chair and who's making the rules and who's passing the laws. We kind of fret about those things a lot, right? Especially every 4 years. We think very hardly about these things. And we're going to see this story taking place on the backdrop of a lot of people competing for power, a lot of people trying to assert their authority, a lot of people exercising great dominion. And we're going to be reminded throughout this that God is ultimately in charge of all of this. That God is accomplishing His purposes through the affairs of man. So that's kind of that transition of empire. So let's get into specifically the story of what we're going to be seeing. Just a little reminder of Old Testament Israel history. About 722 BC, you've got the Assyrians, again, who were the big kingdom at the time. They took over the northern kingdom of Israel. That left a little while where the southern kingdom of Judah was kind of the lone holdout. They lasted a little bit longer. There were some stories in the Old Testament about how God preserved that kingdom a little longer. There were some periods of revival. We've got people like the prophet Isaiah, and you remember the stories of Hezekiah and some of those that were able to, through the Lord, stand against the Assyrians and keep Judah independent for a little bit longer. But eventually, Judah is going to go into sin, and God is going to have to judge them as well. And so the nation that God uses specifically to judge Judah is going to be the Babylonians. The Babylonians, we'll see in just a moment, are going to conquer the Assyrians, and part of winning and beating the Assyrians is that they also conquer and defeat Israel, Judah, the southern kingdom. And their methodology, we'll see in the first couple of verses of Daniel 1, is to take the best and the brightest of a land and bring them back to Babylon. And that's going to be where we're going to refer to the Babylonian captivity. A number of the Jews are going to be taken back to Babylon now as captives. That's actually going to happen on a couple of different occasions. There's going to be a time later where they'll come back and take some more captives from Israel back to Babylon. And they'll come in a third time and take some more back. But we're going to see Daniel's going to go about during this time period. He's going to be one of those first round of captives. Daniel's probably born around 620 or so. 605 is going to be when the captivity begins. So Daniel's going to be about 50 years old when this begins. And we'll see some of the specifics and some of the politics that go along with it. So let's start looking at the verses. That's kind of the biggest picture here. So let's think about what's going on. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, he says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it." So verse 1 is just kind of orienting us to this. That this is when Judah is taken captive. Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonian king, is in charge. He's taking control. The book introduces us to this statement. Look at chapter 1, verse 1 again. Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. That makes it sound like, oh wow, Nebuchadnezzar, he's the big guy. He's the one in charge. Can I direct your attention to verse 2, though? It says, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah." We're going to be introduced right off the bat to the fact that Nebuchadnezzar's not really in charge of this. He's there, he's kind of like the tool, but ultimately, God's in charge of this. But this is something that God is bringing about. And that introduces us to a couple of themes in the book that I want us to watch for as we start walking through this. One of the things that we're going to see, we see it introduced right at the very beginning with the Lord giving Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, is we're introduced to this theme of God being in charge. The term we sometimes use for that is God's sovereignty. That God is the top of the heap there. He's the point of the pyramid. He's the one in charge. And this book is going to introduce us to the reality that God is certainly in charge of individuals. We're going to see God protecting Daniel and God using his authority to take care of his friends and to preserve individuals. We're also going to see God in charge of nations. It's going to be the Lord that gives over Israel to the Babylonians. But it's also going to be, we're going to see through some of Daniel's visions, that it's the Lord that brought up Babylon, and it's the Lord that will bring down Babylon. And the Lord will cause nations to rise, and the Lord will cause nations to fall, all to accomplish his purposes. Because God's in charge. And ultimately, all of history is to accomplish God's agenda. And that's an important reminder for each of us. Because we do get caught up in the politics. We do get caught up in the questions about the future, what's going to happen tomorrow, and whether that's personally, what's my future hold, whether that's nationally, what happens to us in November, whether that happens long term, what's God doing? Don't forget the question. It's what God's doing. God's in charge. And the book of Daniel is going to help us see that. Let me introduce you, though, pause on that for a little bit, and introduce you to a couple of other themes that come up in this book, some other things I want you to watch for as we walk through the book of Daniel. Another theme that's very dominant in this book is God's love and care for his people. We're going to see that this happens, the Lord gave them over. It happens specifically because of sin. There's some history behind this. There's some things that Israel has been doing wrong. There's some constructive discipline that God needs to bring to them. But I do want you to catch, this is not because God is mean. It's not because God is cruel. It's not because God doesn't care. Even these, we call them unpleasant circumstances that they're going to go through, are going to demonstrate to them the love and care of God for his people. He knows how much to discipline them. He knows how much they can face. He knows what they can go through. He knows when to bring about the protection and when to allow some things to occur. And he's doing it all out of love and concern for his people. We'll see it in the prophecies later when Daniel chapter 9, Daniel was greatly concerned for the future of his nation. Lord, what's going to happen next? And God says, I haven't forgotten any of my promises. Every promise I've ever made to my people is going to be fulfilled. And despite your circumstances and despite what you don't understand, God says, I love my people. And I'm concerned for them. I care for them. I think that's a good theme for us to be reminded of. Sometimes we imagine if we go through a hard time, then what did I do wrong? Well, sometimes we do go through hard times because we do wrong. But sometimes we go through hard times. And it's part of what God is accomplishing, what God is doing. And God, even when we are disciplined, God never stops loving us. He never stops caring for us. And the fact that he disciplines us tells us that he loves us. Because he wants us to do right. He wants us to be with him. So look at our circumstances and look at our situations in light of God's love and care for us. The book of Daniel will teach us that. Now, the theme that's going to come up repeatedly in the book of Daniel is the pride and the depravity of man. We'll see some good examples to remind ourselves that people are kind of stuck on themselves. And yet, God is ultimately the only one that deserves worship and the only one that deserves our attention. We're going to see Nebuchadnezzar dealing with pride throughout the book. He gets a little inflated over all of his accomplishments. And we'll see the Lord having to humble him. We'll see in Daniel chapter 5, his grandson, Belshazzar, who also gets a little, as my dad used to say, big for his britches, and has to be humbled. We'll see King Darius having an appeal to his pride. Oh, no one should ask anything but anyone but you. Okay, that's a good law. That was a terrible law. We'll see all of these examples of the pride of men, people who get inflated views of themselves to the point where they forget about God. It'll be a good lesson and reminder to each of us. We do get kind of stuck on ourselves. We do kind of get our feelings hurt when people don't do what we want them to do and don't give us the attention that we feel like we deserve. And there'll be some good lessons in here about the pride and the depravity of man. I said this book has always been used by God as a book of encouragement. One of the encouraging things that comes out is that the Messiah is coming. This is a book that predicts not only the first coming of Christ. We'll see some very specific references to when Messiah comes the first time, what we refer to as Christmas, when Jesus was born. But this book also has a lot of information about what we look forward to still. It's the second coming of the Messiah. The rule and reign and the return of the reestablishment of righteousness in the world and ultimately the next one, God's kingdom being established, the wrongs being made right and the curse being lifted and God exercising his full and direct authority on the earth again. Some great things to look forward to in the future. I sing the song all the time. This world is not my home, we're just passing through. And sometimes we need to remind ourselves of that the trials and the tribulations and the problems of this life in an eternal sense are very temporary. Because Jesus is going to rule and reign. His kingdom is going to be established. This is a book that's going to remind us of all of that. So keep all of those things in mind as we walk through it. And let's go back now to Daniel chapter 1 and look at some specifics here from this first chapter of the book of Daniel. Again, verse 1 says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem to besiege it." This is about 605 BC, so we're about 600 years or so before the time of Christ. Jehoiakim, that's referenced here, connect it maybe to some other things that you remember from Old Testament. Remember King Josiah. King Josiah was the boy king, and he had a really good experience. He led Israel or Judah through one of their last great periods of revival. He seemed to be a really good guy. This is his grandson that is now king. If you remember some things about Josiah, what happened to him, he, we'll see in just a moment, got involved in a battle that he shouldn't have. Stuck his nose in somebody else's business, you could say, and ended up dying because of it. And so another king replaced him, and then another king is on the throne. That king here is Jehoiakim. Maybe you remember Jehoiakim's name. He's the king that you read about in the book of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah sent him a message of judgment, and Jehoiakim read it and said, "I don't like this," and he cut it all up to pieces and tried to destroy it. Well, this won't happen. These judgments won't take place. Yeah, they will. And this is him. He's kind of a jerk. Terrible person, terrible individual. He's the one who's king now when this captivity takes place. To put it in some other frames of reference, other people who are alive at this time, Jeremiah, the prophet, is alive at this time. He's been prophesying that this was coming. He's going to be affected by this. Another prophet that you've heard of from the Old Testament, a man by the name of Ezekiel, he's alive during this time. He's going to go in a second wave of captives that's going to be taken to Babylon. So even at Daniel, there's a lot going on. Some of the big names from the Old Testament, some of the big prophets, some of the big individuals are all a part of, in a sense, this story. Nebuchadnezzar, the king that's referred to here, we kind of think about him. One thing that history tells us is that when this took place here at 605, he's only about 22 years old when he's essentially conquering the world. I don't know what you were doing at 22, but taking over the world was probably not at the top of my agenda. I'm still trying to learn how to tie my shoes or something. I don't know. But he was the general, he was the leader of the Babylonian armies. His father was actually king of the empire at the time. But Nebuchadnezzar has been expanding and leading his battles and being very successful. And just kind of give you a sense of how this story unfolds. Babylon, so you kind of got the picture of the ancient world here. You got Israel here on the side, Babylon over here between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Nebuchadnezzar started expanding, and they started expanding the Babylonian Empire, and the Assyrian Empire controlled all of this territory. And so Babylonians are going to take over and fight the Assyrians, and they end up fighting at a place called Carchemish, and big battle is going to take place, and this is going to be kind of the definitive battle. Who's going to rule the world? Is it going to be Babylon, or who's it going to be Assyria? Well, there's a lot of the world that's interested in who's going to control things, and so the Egyptians are going to come up and try to join up with the Assyrians to defend themselves against the Babylonians. Well, in doing so, they marched through Israel and kind of took over Israel as they passed through, and put a new king on the throne. That's how Jehoiakim got to be king in the first place. They put him on the throne and march on out. This is the battle that Josiah was supposed to stay out of. God says, "Don't get involved with this," and Josiah says, "No, I'm gonna fight." And he ends up dying. And so, technically speaking, at this point, Egypt kind of controls Israel. But this big battle takes place, and Nebuchadnezzar wins it. And now he is in full control of the world. By defeating the Egyptians, he basically controls all of this territory, and by default, controls Israel. So he marches down to Jerusalem just to kind of, assert his control. I just want to show you I'm the boss. I just want to show you, look, I've conquered the people who conquered you, so now I own you, and you guys are going to be my servants. Now, one of the things that he does in order to assert his authority over Israel is, anytime you conquer another nation in those days, the assumption was that your gods are better than their gods, right? If your gods were better than our gods, you would have won. Our gods are better than your gods. So he's assuming the Babylonian gods are better than the other gods that he defeated. And so he goes to the temple there in Jerusalem, and part of his just showing you I'm in charge is he goes to the temple, takes some of the stuff, takes some of the artifacts and some of the furnishings and some of the gold and the silver, just to, it's like a bully, just to show you I can. And he says, okay, look, if you guys will worship, if you guys will just be subservient to me, you'll accept my rule, you'll pay your taxes, this is all that has to happen. And that's what's going on here in verse 1. But again, I remind you, that verse, in verse 2, says that all of this is happening not because of Nebuchadnezzar's great military might. It's not happening because he's a great military strategist, although he was. It's not happening because the Babylonian gods are actually superior to the gods of Israel, to the God of Israel. We know none of that is true. Verse 2 says the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and gave him the vessels of the house of God to carry into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. This all happens by the permission of the Lord. So let's ask the question, why is this going on? Why would God let this happen? Why would God let his people be defeated? Why would he let the temple treasures be sacked? Why would he let this take place? Well, this verse doesn't go into it, but other scriptures tell us exactly why these things took place. Why was God sending Israel into captivity? One of the reasons was that Israel had forsaken God's law and disregarded God's covenant. All the way back to the beginning of the nation, God had told Israel, if you'll obey me, you'll be my kingdom of priests. If you'll obey me, you can dwell in the land and you can represent me to the world. But if you disobey me, God says, I'll have to drive you out. I'll have to send you into other places. I'll send you into captivity. God says, either way, you're going to be a good object lesson. You're going to be an object lesson of what happens to people who obey me, or you're going to be a good object lesson of what happens to people who don't obey me. Either way, you're going to represent me to the world. You're going to tell the world who I am, either through your obedience or even through your disobedience. Well, obviously through Israel's history, at this point, they've been going through an awful lot of disobedience. They've turned away from God. They've rejected God. They've broken God's covenant. Isaiah would say in chapter 24, about 100 years or so before these events, he was already telling the people, the earth is defiled under the inhabitants thereof because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Bottom line is Israel didn't do what she was supposed to do. She didn't fulfill her responsibility to obey the Lord and to represent God accurately. And one of the consequences of that would be that she would be driven from the land. She would be taken out in captivity. Part of how she broke that covenant, part of what her sin was that she had turned to other gods. She had fallen into idolatry. 2 Kings 17 says, so it was that the children of Israel sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt, and had feared other gods. One of the reasons why God is going to let Israel be captured, why he's going to send them into captivity, is to show them who they really should be trusting in. Israel is constantly getting just attracted by the flashy things of these other gods. These other gods, they let their people do this, or these other gods let their people do this. And so Israel is constantly going after, their whole history. They're always worshiping other gods and leaving the true Lord. And it's almost like God says at some point, all right, you want those other gods? Let's see what they can do for you. Let's see if those gods you serve can help you. Let's see if those gods that you worship, if they have any power, if they have any might, if they have any ability to deliver. At some point, God lets them have what they think they wanted. And then they found out it wasn't what they wanted after all. You ever been there? You ever had something like, I want this, and I want this, and I want this, and you knew you should. you shouldn't go there, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't want that. And sometimes God will let you have what you wanted just to show you, what you should have done. He'll let you have consequences for your actions. And that's exactly what he does with Israel. The Lord is going to deliver them, give them over to the Babylonians, partly because they wanted to trust other gods. God was going to show them what that does. I'm going to mention this one, and then we're going to revisit this one later, because this one has, when we talk about why he sent them into captivity, this has to do with how long they were going into captivity. There were a number of prophecies back in Jeremiah and also in 2 Chronicles where God not only told them that they were going into captivity, but he told them how long it would last. He said, you're going to go into captivity for 70 years. The biblical way of saying that is 70 years. So you're going to be gone for 70 years. I'm going to give you this amount of time kicked out of the land. And in the book of 2 Chronicles, he gives us some hints as to why God picked that number. Was this just random? Was this just pull a number out of a hat? God says that the length of time that they would be in captivity is going to be tied to something specific. He says, then they escaped from the sword, carried away into Babylon to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed, he says, her Sabbaths. That God chose that amount of time to let the land rest. Now, again, I'm going to mention this now, but we'll come back and revisit it later because it's going to come up in one of the prophecies down the road. Go back in your minds to what you know about the nation of Israel and her laws. Remember when God first set up the nation, he told them, I want you to take one day out of every 7 and I want you to rest. Take one day and just let the land, or just take a day off. Just don't work. I'll bless you, make sure you have enough, but you take one day off and you just set it apart for me. We understand the concept of a Sabbath, one day out of every 7. There was another part of Israel's law, though, that was closely related to that. God didn't ask them to just take one day off out of every 7. He actually told them, when you're in the land, I want you to take 1 year off out of every 7 years. And I want you to not just rest physically, I want you to let the land rest. Now, looking back on that, we kind of wonder, maybe the Lord's trying to teach us something about, how agriculture works, right? If you overplant the land too often, you till it up too much, you put too much in without giving nutrients back to the soil, it ends up wearing out. We found that out in the Dust Bowl back in American history. Maybe God was teaching them some, environmental practices there, but the point was God gave them a law and says, I want you in the 6th year, I'll double your crops so you'll have enough, but I want you to not plant, I want you to not do anything, let the land rest for 1 year out of every 7. But what it looks like happens is the nation of Israel comes into the promised land back under Moses. They come in, they conquer the land, and we know they observed the Sabbath day. We have evidence of that. But there's no evidence that they ever actually observed that Sabbath year. And by the time you get to the time of the captivity, they've been in the land for almost 500 years, 490 years or so, that they've been in the land and have never observed a Sabbath year as far as we can tell. And it looks like what God is doing here is saying, look, you guys owe me 70 years. There's 70 Sabbaths Sabbath years that you have left out. So you're going into captivity because of idolatry. But the length of time is also because you've broken my law. You're going to be in captivity for 70 years, he says, because of my Sabbaths. The land is going to keep the Sabbath. Just remind me from that. We never really get away with anything, do we? So many times we think there's no immediate consequence to an action. It's like, got away with that one. I don't think God let them get away with this. Just because consequences are sometimes delayed, in this case, 490 years, doesn't mean there's no consequence to our behavior. You never get away with sin. And the nation of Israel didn't get away with it. God says you're going into captivity, and the length of time is determined specifically as a direct result of the sins that you've committed. Well, he sends them off into captivity. So let's get caught up on what happens to them when they go. Let's pick it up in verse 3. It says, and the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, understanding science, such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, in whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So the king here gives an instruction. He says, I want you to take the best and the brightest of the lands that we conquer, And it wasn't just Israel, they probably did this of any land that they conquered. They said, I want you to take the best and the brightest, and I want you to bring them to Babylon specifically. So the beginning of this captivity wasn't like taking everybody. They went through and they talks about people of the king's house, members of the royal family, people who had probably been very well educated already, and people who could continue to be educated, people who were capable of learning. He said, I want you to take them and I want you to bring them to Babylon to be my servants. Anything about that kind of makes a little bit of sense. If you're going to, conquer another nation, that's a good methodology to use, right? You take their best and brightest out so that they're kind of weakened as a nation, and now their best and brightest works for you, so you're kind of strengthened as a nation. The fact that he's telling them to take the king's family, well, that's going to keep the people in Israel back in line, because now you've kind of got, hostages. You've got members of the royal family back in your land, so it kind of helps them to try to behave themselves back in the original country. You got family and friends now that, okay, I need to behave because I don't want anything to happen to my family. There's a lot of interesting methodology here, and the point is to build up the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar and to weaken the kingdom of Israel. It says that they take these children, children here, the word there for children is the idea of young men, people who were older than kids, but not old enough to be married. So we're talking teenagers here, probably somewhere around 15 years old or so. Daniel and his friends are going to be when this is taken. Old enough to be able to learn things, but not too old to have to unlearn a lot. And so the point is to kind of bring them and to teach them the ways of the Babylonians, to basically turn them into Babylonians, so that they would be able to serve the king effectively. So that's how they end up in the king's house. Verse 5 says that the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So you can almost say sends them to college. So you got a 3-year curriculum. So for the next 3 years, I'm going to provide for you, I'm going to feed you, I'm going to do everything while you're learning our language and you're learning our culture and you're learning to be a Babylonian. That's the plan. The intention is at the end of 3 years, well, then you'll be able and fit to serve in the royal household. It's probably something like where, I kind of go to school. I don't know how many of you went to school and didn't know what your major was going to be. Over the course of education, you take some classes and you discover some aptitudes and you find some things that you're good at. And that's probably what this curriculum was designed to do, find out where they could serve, and then at the end of 3 years to put them in different positions and to give them different jobs to do. So the goal is ultimately that they'll stand before the king. Now verse 6 tells us, now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and Hananiah of Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So the passage is going to call attention to 4 of these young men. There are a lot of them. So basically all the members of the royal family are going to be taken to Babylon. Anybody that was worth anything. But the Bible singles out 4 of these individuals to tell us something about them, something that was special. Now, let's pause first of all, though, on verse 7. It says that one of the first things the Babylonians did was to give them new names. The goal of changing somebody's name, and when we think about how important names are, it ultimately has to do with your identity, how you're going to be identified, who you are. We associate names with people, right? You kind of picture somebody, as soon as you say their name, their image comes to mind, their identity comes to mind. It's what we do with names. And so giving somebody a different name would have been kind of a big deal. It's more than just a language transition. It's really trying to get them to associate with a certain thing. Very much kind of a change of identity kind of idea. And this one is very targeted. These aren't just random, like, okay, I'm going to call you Bill now. I'm going to call you Fred. They're not just pulling names out of a hat. I want you to see something about these name changes, something the Babylonians were trying to accomplish with these young men. I think it's very revealing. Let's think about their name changes. It says that Daniel gets his name changed to Belteshazzar. Daniel's name means God is my judge. Now, it looks like what the Babylonians tried to do with these name changes is try to give them a Babylonian equivalent. So they instead of using God's name, the El there, the name for God, they switch it to one of the Babylonian gods. His name was Bel. And so they're going to replace God with Bel. It is kind of interesting that the way they translated God as my judge, they said God protects my life. And maybe that's just their idea of what a judge does. The idea of a judge is a protector, one who doesn't. But you see what they're trying to get his thinking to do, even just by changing his name? Your God couldn't protect you. Your God is not in charge of you. Your God is not the judge of you. Now you need to look to Bel. Now it's Bel that's going to do this. Bel is going to replace God in your life. Hananiah. His name in Hebrew means the mercy of Jehovah. See that in it. It's always the portion of the name of God and the ending of that. And so the mercy of God. This one kind of makes me smile because I kind of wonder if the Babylonians didn't really have a good name for mercy. They didn't think about their God as merciful. The gods of the rest of the world, they didn't have gods who were kind and gentle. They had gods who were mean and vengeance. And so their translation of Hananiah's name, instead of the mercy of Jehovah, is the command of Aku. Aku is another one of their gods. And so you kind of see how they kind of think, but do you see the point here? You're no longer affiliated with your God. Now you have to rely on our gods. You're to obey the commands of Aku. You got Mishael. Mishael's name means who is like God. Well, this one translated easy because they said, no, don't think about your God. Now you can ask the question, who is like Aku? Who is like our God? Our God is obviously superior to your God because our God defeated your God. So now you need to think of yourself in terms of being the servant of our gods. And the same thing comes up with Azariah. Azariah's name means servant of Jehovah. No. Now you're going to serve yet another one of our gods, a god by the name of Nebo. Now you serve us. I just look at that and I see what they're trying to do. They're trying to replace the submission and the dependence upon their God with their gods. They're trying to replace what they were counting on and what they were trusting in with something else. Pause on that for a second though. More than this being a lesson about name etymology, I'm not asking you what your name means in another language. But can I ask you about identity? Does your life show who you serve? Do you find your identity connected to God specifically? It's not about what your name means, but I do want you to think about, what does your life say? If people were to look at you, would they know that you are affiliated with the one true God? If they were to observe you, if they were to watch how you live and the way you make decisions, the things that you do, the things that you won't do, does it give evidence as to who you are affiliated with? They're trying to take these kids who had this affiliation with the God of Israel, and they're saying, no, you need to shift that. You need to transition that. You need to blend in. You need to fit in now with our culture. I think it's interesting as you look through these, and I'm not trying to make a derogatory statement about Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, because from this point on, the text is going to use their new Babylonian names. But it is interesting. Daniel, pretty consistently, gets referred to as Daniel throughout the rest of the book. Eventually, even the kings will address him as Daniel. There's a king later who's going to use his Babylonian name, but for the most part of the book, you can tell, at least with Daniel, it doesn't stick, and his identity was so clear, his testimony was so upright, that eventually even the pagans reverted back and began referring to him by his original name. And I think that's, use the phrase, goals, that people would be so clear on our testimony that they can't help but see God in us. I think that comes about specifically from verse 8. Verse 8 is that verse that I tell my students all the time, every good youth pastor worth his salt has preached this verse out of the book of Daniel. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. I don't think it's any accident that Daniel's testimony remains clean throughout this book, because Daniel made some purposeful decisions. He purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. The passage doesn't get into what exactly the problem was. My guess is, quite honestly, the food simply wasn't kosher. That this was not the kind of food that Daniel knew he was supposed to be eating. Remember, Daniel is apparently greatly appreciative and understanding of who God is and what God expects. He probably understands, maybe even from the preaching of Jeremiah, that the reason they're going into captivity is by disregarding God's law. And so Daniel says, you know what, I'm not going to disregard God's law. God has said there's certain foods we can eat and certain foods we can't eat. And I can't eat this food. And so Daniel makes the decision right away. I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to defile myself with this portion of the king's meal. And I think about everything, in a sense, that Daniel had going against him. Every reason that he could have given in. Actually, at the very beginning about excuses. We like to make excuses. We like to defend our behavior. Well, the reason I did this was this. The reason I did this was this. You know, sometimes we can come up with some really good excuses. And yet Daniel doesn't. Despite the fact of refusing to eat the meat might be considered an insult to the king, Daniel purposed in his heart. The pressure from his peers would have been huge. I mean, out of all of the captives that get brought to Babylon, these are the only 4 that we're told made this kind of decision. You think there was some peer pressure of other people coming along saying, just eat the meat, dude. Don't rock the boat. Don't make waves. And yet Daniel purposed in his heart. Being different could jeopardize his chances of advancement. When you think about when you were 50, how afraid you were to stand out and to be different from everybody else. When you're 15, you want to blend in. You want to be cool. And Daniel didn't give in. He purposed in his heart. I'm guessing the food was good. I mean, there was something really appealing to this. I mean, the king's not serving garbage to his best servants. And yet Daniel purposed in his heart. Judah and the priest were 900 miles away. Nobody would know. Yet Daniel purposed in his heart. There could even be a temptation to be a little bitter about, why should I obey God's laws? God's the one that sent us here. God let this happen. And yet Daniel purposed in his heart. Think about this, and I ask the question, what excuses do we make for sin? We give in to sin so readily. We blame other people, we blame our culture, we blame our circumstances. Sometimes we might even subconsciously blame God for the circumstances of the situations that we're in and say, well, I had to do this. What we need is the realization of who God is and who we are in Him. Daniel never lost sight of the fact that God was his judge. That ultimately he's accountable to God. And because of that, Daniel says, I'm purposing in my heart not to defile myself. I'm not going to make excuses. I'm not going to give in to the pressure. I'm not going to succumb. I'm going to do what's right. And that is the role model I think we should emulate. So I just ask you the question, where's your heart purposed today? Have you made a conscious decision, regardless of whatever else is going on, no matter what the pressures are, no matter what the circumstances are, I'm going to do right. I'm going to purpose in my heart not to defile myself with whatever it is that is tempting to us. Good lesson for us to take away from the book of Daniel. Let me give you a couple of announcements this morning as we wrap this up, and we'll pick up with the rest of Daniel's story next week. First of all, there's a mom and daughter tea for those of you if you have a 1st to 6th grade girl. Girls and their moms are invited to join for a mother and daughter tea on Saturday, April 6th. Sandwiches, scones, dainties, and some other fun activities. That is $7 per person, and you can register and pay on around by March 31st. So that is coming up on April 6th. Second thing is our couple times a year we send out a plea for volunteers to help out with the this time the spring share-a-thon. Rejoice Radio does share-a-thons a couple times a year to help raise funds to keep the radio station going. And this year it's Wednesday and Thursday, April 10th and 11th. And they need volunteers to help answer phones. There's a computer program that you sit in front of, and basically you just ask the questions that are in front of you and type in the answers. It's not a super involved training process. If you can talk on the phone and punch a button, you'll be fine for it. They also will give you some additional training. But if you're available for that, you can email rejoiceradio@rejoice.org and let them know some times that you're available, and there's some sign-up information that will be available to you as well there. And then one class-specific announcement. I sent out a realm announcement yesterday and also put it on Facebook, but I wanted to talk to you about it personally. I remember back in December, we put together 100 giggle bags for Micah's Pantry. These are the bags specifically that they give to patients who check in at the pediatric cancer unit at the hospital. And she texted me a couple of days ago and said they just run out, which is, at first I was a little like, oh, I mean, think about it, it's just been a couple of months. And that means they've already been through 100 new cancer patients there at the pediatric ward. But we do want to supply some more, because this has been, she said, a huge encouragement to the families. In fact, the day that they delivered them, they gave out the first one. And so it's a huge opportunity to be a very practical blessing. She includes little games and puzzles to help the kids while they're going through the registration and check-in process to keep them occupied while everything else is going on. And there's also a track in there about their own experience with cancer with Micah, to be able to give to the families and to share the gospel with them. So it's a great outreach. But here's the deal. We want to put together another assembly party, and we'll do that, but first we need things to assemble. So what I'm encouraging you to do is to follow the links. You can either, like I said, go to the Facebook page or check the realm announcement that I put out yesterday. There's a link there directly to the wish list. You click that link, it takes you right to the wish list, and those are all the items that they need. And as you buy things, they disappear from the list. So as soon as we can get that list cleared out and all the supplies have been delivered, then we can schedule an assembly party and get them all put, and we'll do them all back together. This time, because we went through the 100 so fast, this time we're targeting 200. And so there's a little bit more on the list, but you know, if you can, go in there, just click a couple buttons, whatever you can manage, and it will be put to good use. And so I encourage you to do that. I'll try to send out periodic reminders, and then as soon as she tells me we have all the supplies, we'll put it on the calendar, we'll have a class activity, and we'll get together and we'll put this together quick. So I wanted you to know that was coming and what that was there for, and let you know this has been a huge blessing. One last shout out, and then I will send you on your way. I just want to commend you. Last week we did the thank you note to send to the church office for the donuts, and we all signed that. And Pastor actually sent me an email this week and said that was the first time he's ever gotten a thank you from an adult Bible study for the donuts. And I'm like, again, sad and encouraged at the same time, but I wanted to let you know it was appreciated, and thank you for your time and doing so. I will see you back here.